Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Melissa Begg, and I have the great honor of serving as the Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. We're delighted to welcome today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Linda Sprague Martinez. She is next in the Dean's Lecture Series on Inequality and Opportunity at Columbia School of Social Work. Through this series, our community has the chance to come together to explore the complex system of racist and oppressive structures and policies that result inevitably in inequities, with a particular focus on disparities in economic opportunity, educational outcomes, criminal justice, healthcare access, and wellness. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this event, a new member of the CSSW community and a wonderful colleague, Dr. Rob Eschmann. Dr. Eschmann is Associate Professor of Social Work who has recently joined us, coming from the Boston University School of Social Work, where he also served as the Assistant Director of Research at the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. His scholarship centers on educational inequity, community violence, racism, social media, and youth well-being. Furthermore, he explores identifying individual, social, and institutional level hurdles to racial and economic justice, with a particular focus on the incredible efforts made by everyday people to conquer those barriers. He examines how online encounters affect real-life results. His work bridges the divide between virtual and face-to-face encounters, from his studies of the connection between online communication and community violence to his work on race and racism in the digital era. Dr. Eschmann's forthcoming book, When the Hood Comes Off, Racism and Resistance in the Digital Era, systematically examines how online communication has shifted the expressions of racism, its effect on communities of color and society more broadly, and resistance to racism at both individual and structural levels. Dr. Eschmann's work has appeared in many wonderful publications, including Social Problems, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Annual Reviews in Sociology, and on and on. Dr. Eschmann, Rob, it's a pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Begg. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Linda Sprague Martinez, who I had the pleasure of working with for 4 years as a colleague. Dr. Martinez is an associate professor and chair of the macro department at the Boston University School of Social Work. She's also the assistant director for research at the Center for Anti-Racist Research and the co-director of the community engagement for the Boston University Clinical Translational Science Institute. Her research is focused on how assets can be recognized and leveraged by communities to improve living environments and health. Dr. Sprague Martinez has expertise in urban health, community, student and youth engaged research, photo voice, community assessment and mobilization, and qualitative research methods and analyses. I've had the privilege of, serving on a review board where, I don't know if Linda knows this, but I reviewed about 20 grants for a program that was looking to fund community-based research on racism. And Dr. Sprague Martinez's grant was the only one where all the money was going towards the community in terms of training people to be researchers and training youth to do the work. And so I think that she's someone whose motivations and values, show themselves in her work. I also can call her a friend. Our kids FaceTime each other and play video games, even when it's not necessarily screen time. And so, that video communication may happen more often than our Zoom communication. So I'm very honored to be here and to be able to learn from you today, and excited for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks, Dean Begg, for having me. I'm excited to share with you and have the opportunity to present today. Look forward to the questions and the Q&A as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides. So the title of the presentation I'm going to be presenting today is Achieving the Promise of Participatory Research Approaches in the Context of Structural Racism. As Rob mentioned, I'm a participatory researcher. I do community-based participatory research as well as youth-led participatory action research. And my work around community engagement has been cited by the Institute of Medicine as well as many other organizations. So I'll also disclose that I'm an external evaluator for the Boston Public Health Commission Bureau of Child and Family Health, as well as Action for Boston Area Development. And I also like to disclose at the beginning of the presentation when I'm going to talk about particularly structural racism, that The content that I'm going to talk about could cause some discomfort for us. You know, as a society, we don't spend a lot of time talking about racism. It's not even, I would sometimes want to say it's a hush hush topic. Like in my family, I can give the example of cancer. We don't talk about cancer. We don't talk about disease. They start to whisper. I remember when I was little, and it was kind of one of those things that we were quiet about. But racism, we're not even quiet about. We just don't talk about it. It's almost been the extent to which it's been erased, and we don't want to talk about it. But it's here, and it's important for us to be comfortable talking about it. So I'll encourage you as we're having this conversation today. You know, if you start to get uncomfortable, lean into that discomfort, try to figure out where it's coming from, because that's how we're going to move forward. So I'll start off by talking about a little bit about structural racism and white supremacy. Then I will talk about participatory research approaches, the origins, the key tenets, and then their emergence, particularly in health research. When did we see them come on the scene? And then I'll cover some of the challenges. And I'll end with a case example from my own research, a CBPR study that I've been working with for a number of years, focused on near highway exposure and environmental health. So in terms of structural racism, I always like to kind of, when I'm talking about racism, start with David Wellman's definition of racism. He talks about it as a system of advantage based on race. Really quite simple, but at the same time, incredibly complex, right? Because when we think about structural racism specifically, it's really when we see public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, norms, work in various ways, often reinforcing the ways they perpetuate group inequity. And so this is a definition from the Aspen Institute, and it really kind of gets at those broader dimensions and thinks about how racism seeps into our policies, our practices to shape our environments and our communities. And I think when we're talking about racism, we really have to recognize that it's fueled by white supremacy. And white supremacy, we think about it as instances or actions oftentimes that individual acts, but it's also this system. It's part of a broader system of beliefs based on a set of ideas that posit that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of people of color and their ideas and thoughts and actions. And white supremacy remains a dominant ideology in the Western world. So, and when we think about ideology, why is it important to be thinking about ideology? Because ideology is what helps us make meaning of the world. It informs our thinking, our behaviors, our choices, and our views. It informs how we see each other and how we see ourselves in relation to one another. And the dominant ideological messages that we receive reflect the interests of the dominant class in a given society. And that we have to recall that knowledge is not neutral. It's the product of specific historical moments and reflects the ideas, beliefs of definite social groups. And so when we think about, and understand white supremacy, we really need to be thinking of the political economy and the construction of race in our country. It's not by chance that we are where we are right now. White supremacy has been critical for justifying the racial hierarchy. It's critical for justifying capitalism, and our political economy is really dependent on a racial hierarchy. We needed to have that hierarchy in place so that we can justify the institution of slavery, for example. Every sector in our society has pitched in to lend a hand in reproducing it and to ensure its status as the dominant narrative. You know, whether we think about media, whether we think about medicine, education, science, and the arts, all sectors of our society have played a role in maintaining that dominant narrative. And I love this. I know this is really overwhelming, probably on the screen to you as you're looking at it. But what you're looking at right now is probably one of my favorite pictures, which may say too much about me. But what you're looking at right now is essentially an ecological model. It's a linear version of an ecological model. And the reason I like to show this picture, I'm just going to move our pictures around on the screen, but the reason I like to show this picture is because it really does a nice job laying out how these broader macro level factors influence individual well-being. I also like to show it because it spotlights this idea where we circle right here, ideology and the role that ideologies play. Because sometimes we think to ourselves, like, how is it that racism gets under our skin? How is it that it's built into our structures? What do you mean when you're saying, that the structural racism, how does it get in? And I think the thing that we don't always think about is the fact that ideology really seeps into policy. It seeps into all the decisions that we make, and those decisions shape our built environment. They determine land use, they determine transportation patterns, zoning, where buildings are placed. They also shape the social construct, social context that surrounds our built environment. So thinking about where we invest, where we don't invest, ordinances, community capacity, all of those things are shaped by those ideologies. And in turn, we see as we go further downstream, the stressors that play out as a result of those decisions that are inequitable in nature, and that they then lead to the inequitable health outcomes that we see. So the reason I like this picture is because it's very clear, even if it's a lot of words on paper, but it's from a model of environmental health promotion. It was first published way back in 2004. And so this is what poses the challenge for us, because the ideology is so far upstream, shaping policies. When we're, this is this saying that the longer you swim in a culture, the more it becomes invisible to us. And so we don't see it. And we don't see it unless we stop to look at it and really look for it, because we can feel it, but we can't always see it. And so then how does this play into participatory research approaches? And it does so in that participatory research approaches run counter to the dominant ideology of white supremacy, individualism, capitalism. So it really is more based on a collective approach. And so just a little bit about participatory approaches and the foundations. Participatory research approaches come from the foundations of Kurt Lewin, who is a psychologist, as well, and the work of Paulo Freire, an educator, activist, and a philosopher. And so Kurt Lewin had first coined the term action research. And then he also, Kurt Lewin described action research as this comparative research on the conditions and the effects of various forms of social action, and research leading to social action that uses this spiral of steps, or more of like an iterative approach, each which is composed of a circle of planning and action and fact finding about the result of the action. So this continuous process. And then Paulo Freire, who I will say was like my favorite, Paulo Freire really talked about this idea of the banking system of education that we have in the Western world, and that we often assume that folks are coming to us as educators as empty vessels that must be filled with knowledge, when in the reality is that we all have something to teach and we all have something to learn, and that we can't just assume that education is a top-down one-way process, but it's really more circular, and that we're all gaining from one another in each person we come into contact with. And Paulo Freire also worked to really work with folks to identify what are the root causes, and how do we really grapple with our reality and our world that we're experiencing, so that we begin to develop a critical consciousness, or this process of conscientization, where we begin to understand the realities and the factors that are shaping those realities, to identify the inequities, so that we can then act. Right. So with the study for the goal of acting to lead to advance change and to advance justice. And so community-based participatory research is real, or CBPR, which I'll say the CVPR that fall into that alphabet soup of the acronyms. But community-based participatory research is a collaborative approach to research that equitably involves partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strength that each brings. It begins with a process, or with a topic of importance to our communities, and with the aim of combining knowledge with action to advance change, to advance justice, so that we can eliminate, here it says health disparities. And that's partially because CBPR really adopted in health research in an effort to address what was then called disparities. Now we talk about inequities. The language has shifted over the years. And CBPR is driven by a set of key principles and key tenets that underlie it. And this is an early 2003 version of the principles. They haven't shifted that much over time. There was another iteration that came out in 2010. But they all begin with this recognition of the community as a unit of identity. A community has expertise embedded in it. Expertise does not only exist within the academy. It builds community. CBPR also, it's well aligned with social work in that it's strength-based, asset-based, and it recognizes the importance of building on existing resources within communities, facilitates collaboration, equitable partnership across all phases of the research, and ensures power sharing, and really to attend to social inequities. Another key tenet is the fostering of co-learning. Again, you hear that Paulo Freire coming out from the CBPR, and that we're all learning from one another. Researchers have just as much to learn from community partners as community partners to learn from researchers. It integrates and achieves a balance between knowledge generation and intervention for the mutual benefit of all partners. So the reason we're doing this is to advance justice, and we're all going to win at the end, right? It's a collective approach. Focuses on the relevance of public health problems and uses an ecological perspectives that recognizes the multiple determinants of health, and involves a system of a cyclical or iterative process, right? It's not just like I have a hypothesis and I'm going to test the hypothesis and implement by implementing the methods and then moving forward. It's more of a back and forth process of really kind of working with the community, identifying a question, going to the literature, coming back to the question based on the community posed, and then this back and forth process between the literature and the question until we collaboratively develop the methods that will allow us to best answer the question and that really work for all of us. Disseminates the results to all partners and are involved in the dissemination process and this long-term commitment. I think next week I'm actually having lunch with a community partner who I haven't done a project with probably in 7 years, but over the time we are still colleagues and we work together, but we might not always have an active research project, but we have a long-term commitment to community change. And we sometimes will have a project and sometimes we won't, but it doesn't mean that we are not still in relationship. And that's the key with the community-based participatory research, being in relationship with community and partners. So to that end, CBPR isn't a method. Sometimes I'll hear people say, Linda, can you develop a CBPR methods class? And I can say, absolutely not. I can develop a CBPR approach class. Participatory research is an approach. It's not a specific methodology. You can use a participatory approach with just about any methodology. You can apply it across methods, but it's really designed to be applied and to lead to some type of community change or to advance justice. And so sometimes I'll have colleagues that say, Linda, I'd love to be doing CVPR, but I'm really all about big data and I'm looking at this data set. And I'll say, well, I'm glad you love CVPR because we can still do a collaborative process. What's your topic? Who are the key stakeholders? Who stands to be most impacted? Let's talk with them about what are some of the questions they might have for the data that you're looking at. Let's talk to folks about some analyses that you found and how they would interpret it. There's ways to engage community in research, no matter what type of method that you have. Right now, I'm working on a CBPR project that is a randomized control trial, and it's something that came out of the community wanted to explore, and it's a participatory process, but it's a randomized control design. And so sometimes those people don't expect to hear that all at once. So when did we begin to see this increasing interest in community-based participatory research in the context of health? At the time, early 2000s, we were beginning to see this changing research paradigm, moving more towards this multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary team science, which trans team science more popular with I remember the National Cancer Institute at the time, through an initiative. But this was really around this idea that focusing research on a given problem, and that in order to address complex problems, we really needed to bring together scientists from across multiple disciplines. We were also focusing on this at this very same time on more translational and dissemination research, and thinking about how do we translate research, how do we shorten the shelf life of research, so to say, from 17 years to maybe 5. So how do we get research into practice? And then how do we really begin to include people who have been traditionally excluded? So there were these different focus areas that were happening in the early 2000s. And at the same time, there was this growing interest in, at the time, I put it in quotations because we don't use the word health, we don't use the language health disparities as much as we use the word health inequities now, right? To recognize that there's that injustice there, whereas disparities might just assume there's a difference. As we saw that growing interest in health disparities, we saw initiatives through the Department of Health and Human Services priorities begin to shift to health disparities. We saw Center for Disease Control and Prevention launch their Healthy People 2010 initiative. The NIH strategic plan at the time. And I put here the National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities because it was formed and it was a center status, had one of the National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities and the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences had some of the two first CBPR portfolios, grants that they funded at the time. And then the Institute of Medicine report had come out and talking about the importance of addressing health disparities. And so CVPR and health disparities were gaining momentum around the same time period. And the idea was, if we're including people who are most impacted in the decision-making as part of informing the research, then we're going to be able to get to the interventions to address health disparities, because the early block of research that came out between 1990 2000 was really focused on, yes, health disparities, health inequities are present. Then we started to move into the intervention research, and that's really when we saw this uptick in the focus on CBPR within the National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities and the National Institute of on Environmental Health and Health Sciences. And I'll note that National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities did gain institute status with the Affordable Care Act. Was part of that, was they're elevating them to an institute. So we began to see this shift, and I credit one of my great community partners, Elmer Freeman, for this slide that he shared with me. And that when he started to talk about, well, why is it that we need partnerships and why do we need to be working with communities? But if you look at this image, if the cartoon, it says, why is he looking at the risk factors and behaviors when the key lies in the social determinants? And you see it's the scientist, and he's looking under the light. And he's looking under the light because he's looking for his keys. He's lost his keys. And, you know, the cats are there like, did you drop your keys under the light? And the scientist's like, no, I didn't drop them under the light, but this is where I'm looking. But really all these other factors are at play. And my community partner Elmer said, you know, the reality is that communities have, when they're thinking about what's happening in terms of inequities, they're not thinking about disease specific ways. There's these broader issues that are impacting them. And if we don't start focusing on things like racism, poverty, broader, you know, structural factors, environmental exposures, then we're not going to address the inequities that we're seeing in disease areas because there are bigger issues at play. And when we work with communities, that's what we learn, right? Here's an example. It's no surprise, right? And this was a project, I did a project with the Clinical Translational Science Institute back in 2011, about 2010, 2011, when I was at Tufts. And we were, at the time, the CTSI at Tufts had just been funded and their infrastructure grants. And so they wanted to really begin to work with the local communities, our neighborhoods, at the time in Boston neighborhoods, Somerville, and then in Chinatown. And the goal was to kind of talk to communities about what disease areas would you like us to focus on in terms of research. And no surprise is that when we talked to communities about what was important for them to focus on related to health research, is that they didn't, you know, one, communities know what they need to be healthy. And two, that health was not conceptualized by communities as the absence of disease. And that they had a much more holistic view around what health was and what needed to happen to improve health. And oftentimes it involved talking about access to political power, affordable housing, living wages, transportation, health, and the fact that those things were all interconnected. So no surprises there. So I think like one of the big things when we think about the underlying goals of participatory research in terms of advancing justice, improving health, the big questions are, one, who gets to ask the questions? Who gets to interpret the findings? Who gets to tell the story, right? That's what participatory research is really challenging. Who holds the power there? It's really thinking about the redistribution of resources. Rob gave the example of our grant where we gave we didn't give all $50,000 to our community partner, but $48,000 went to our community partner. And really thinking about redistribution of resources, redistributing power, really contesting inequities, co-learning together, and relationship development. Because at the end of the day, we need to find collective action. We need collective action if we're going to advance justice. And that's where you see that CBPR runs counter to societal conceptions of knowledge generation, because at the end of the day, in the context of structural racism and white supremacy, knowledge generation doesn't happen in communities, right? And indigenous knowledge is not valued or seen as knowledge. And there's this assumption that there's a divide between who does the research and who does the work on the ground in communities. And what CVPR says is that we all have a responsibility for generating the knowledge and informing the knowledge generation. And then we all have a responsibility for doing the work on the ground to make the change. We can't separate that. And as researchers, we can't sit inside of our institutions and expect that we're going to have an impact broadly in society in terms of advancing justice. And so that means there are common challenges that are associated with CBPR, as well as other community engaged approaches or participatory approaches. And there's just a couple I have here on the slide as examples, is navigating the academic research enterprise, because we are siloed the way our institutions are set up. Distribution of financial resources and fiscal control. Another incredible challenge for how do we get resources and share resources with communities in order to work collaboratively. Most grant or funding structures that fund research grants are designed to fund universities, institutions. They're not designed to fund community partners. Most institutions have a hard time funding small grassroots partners because of the risk that's associated with it. And so when they do the risk assessment, community partners don't come out very high in terms of someone you want to subcontract with oftentimes. Then there's the whole idea of credibility and expertise, and who gets to be an expert, who is credible in terms of knowledge and having expertise. Power differentials and issues of control. There's mechanisms for inclusion or communication and decision-making. Trust. Oftentimes our institutions have a history with communities that are not very collaborative, and so that leads to trust. We have oftentimes our communities have experienced feeling mistreated by research, or maybe there's this notion of extraction where knowledge is being taken from the community. And then there's just a lot of time involved in repairing relationships and building relationships. And our systems of rewards within institutions for academic researchers really don't give us a lot of time, right? I don't know, we're all on a clock, right? We have so much time to publish so many papers, to bring in so many grants, to do so much work, that the time it takes to build an authentic relationship that will lead to broader partnership grants is challenging, finding that balance. And so these are all challenges that are associated with the construction of the academy. So again, sometimes we don't name all of it. I have here back in the small corner of the screen is the fish, right? We're part of this culture. We forget that, we're rushing until my community partner's like, Linda, what do you mean you can't sit and have lunch with me and we can't talk and catch up? And I'm like, look, I got to write 6 papers. I'm on a deadline. No, but we have to stop ourselves and say, well, wait a minute. What is the work we're doing? Where do our priorities lie? And how do we advance justice from our position? So I'm going to transition here. I'm going to give you an example, share with you an example of a CVPR study. This is the case of 2 communities, 1 highway in the fight for clean air. It's an environmental health project. It's part of the Community Assessment of Freeway Exposure and Health, CAFE. CAFE is an umbrella for multiple related community-based participatory research studies focused on air pollution. And specifically, they're focused on ultrafine particles. It's a type of air pollution and car exhaust. It also comes from other sources, as you can see in the infographic here. Community partners are involved in all aspects of CAFE. That involves proposal development. They lead the study, collecting and analyzing and interpreting data. And I put the website here in case you want to learn more about CAFE, caferesearch.org. But CAFE is a study that was initially funded back in 2008, the first CAFE study. There are multiple NIH funded, Kresge funded, EPA funded studies that are involved in CAFE. I first started working with a team. It's a diverse team of environmental scientists, public health scientists, and then I'm a social scientist that works with them. And it first began with community partners in Somerville, Massachusetts, having a lot of concerns related to near highway exposure. And they approached researchers at Tufts University, who over time, the research team has become much broader, but started to study the relationship between ultrafine particulate matter and cardiovascular functioning and blood pressure. And now more recently, they're looking at inflammation. And I started working with them initially as a researcher who was studying their process of how they partnered, how they came together, their team dynamics, given the complexity of the study and the number of partners. And then over time, I started to study, which I'll present to you a little on today, more so how they've come to translate, how the community is translating knowledge that's generated through the research partnership into action in the community. Because so often in CVPR partnerships, what will happen is we focus so much on the research in the beginning that the action over time is lost because time might run out on the grant for a number of different reasons. Maybe by the time it takes to analyze all the data, if there's not a continuous process in place, that the action can be curved at the end. And so with this project, action was a very key and important piece. And so that's what I've been studying, kind of what happens with the research that's generated. So I'll share with you a little about that. So a little bit about the study that I'm going to talk specifically about is a near highway pollution from research to action. It's funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Science, and it's a R01. But there's different aims. There are environmental science aims, there are public health action aims, and then the social science aims. And so I lead the social science aims, and those are to examine the process of designing and implemented community level strategies to mitigate traffic related air pollution, or TRAP. And then to explore the contributions, both positive and negative, of community level factors that influence TRAP related research and action. So really understanding kind of what are the strategies that are in place, and then how does context influence that? And so it's focused on two communities, Somerville, Massachusetts, which is just a little bit north of Boston on the other side of Cambridge, over the river, we say, over the river and through Cambridge to Somerville, and then Boston Chinatown neighborhood. And so the distinct thing to keep in mind in Boston Chinatown neighborhood, you can kind of see on the slide, it's hit by the intersection of two highways, the 95 and the 90. And then Somerville has it's been cut off. And actually the very first picture I have was the image of the 93 being built, and it cut the neighborhood, like cut the city right cut the side off of the city. And so just to jump in a little bit around in terms of some of the environmental justice issues happening in the communities, two very different communities. So Boston, as I was saying, Chinatown is a neighborhood in Boston. So it's one district in a broader city. Somerville is its own municipality. Somerville is a community where if you went to Somerville today, you would think, oh, wow, it's a community that's experienced a tremendous amount of gentrification. It's traditionally a new immigrant community, very diverse, turn of the century, diverse immigrants from Portugal, Italy, and Ireland. And then over time, now we have larger communities from El Salvador, Brazil, are probably two of the largest groups that are in Somerville. But it's, again, like I say, gentrified, except for the section where you see the highway, the 93 cutting through. And then Boston Chinatown neighborhood is experiencing gentrification squeeze on both sides. It has Tufts University Medical School is in the middle of it, and then the neighborhood around it, the different districts, it's kind of in a place where it's quickly starting to gentrify along the highway. It has the south end on one side, pushing it, and then the downtown district on the other. And so within Chinatown and Somerville, you can see that and this is from the EJ screen, the EPA data, you can see that the pollution, the traffic related air pollution is in the high zone in both communities along the highway. Both communities in the neighborhood along the highway are low income, Chinatown more so than Somerville, because Somerville has experienced gentrification and is shifting neighborhood demographic, and there's some development that's happening in that area. And then also in terms of communities of color, we see more so in Chinatown and Somerville again, and that's the shift that's been happening over the last 10 years in that section of Somerville. And so one of the things in terms of thinking about our conceptual diagram for thinking from research to action, this is a study where the PI structure on the study is a community partner and a researcher. And the first half of the study is led by the research. The community partner the researcher has more power in the beginning in terms of leading, and then the community partner takes over, where the second half of the study, the budget shifts. And when I say power, I budget specifically, the budget shifts more towards the community side, because it goes from the environmental science research to the public health action that's led by community partners, both Chinatown and Somerville community partners, as well as there's the Massachusetts Area Planning Committee that's more regional, works with the groups as well. And then the social science study is more of a study of the process of the public health action playing out. But the goal is that there's community identified priorities, then that's studied by the team. Over time, there's been new stakeholders that are integrated, new community members as we move into the action phase, and then leading into policy practice, that there's going to be some change at the policy level. Initially, when we were looking at the kind of theoretical models to understand the dissemination, we were looking at the interactive systems framework, but it didn't really apply because the communities are using more of an organizing framework in their approach to translation. Originally, the researchers were writing in the grant thinking they'll use more of an interactive systems approach, but they ended up using an organizing approach. So I'll show you. So the key questions are: how are communities translating research into action? What are the systems they're targeting for change? What strategies are they employing? What are the conceptual factors at the community and team levels that influence the local effort? And how do those efforts vary across communities between Somerville and Chinatown? The methods that I use are qualitative case study, use community observation, attending community team meetings, charrette meetings, planning meetings, community forums, events, and conduct observations at events, as well as document reviews from meeting minutes, reports, legislation that's proposed, presentations that are conducted by community partners, and then also press releases that community partners put out, reports that they put out from meetings, and then key informant interviews starting with grant community partners, and then bridging out to in each community with local planners, activists, elected officials, municipal staff, developers, and then resident leaders who participate in multiple meetings. And so when there are community meetings, I collect all the attendance forms, and that's where I start for reaching out to folks who are participating in the initiatives. In terms of, so all of the data that I collect observation notes, meeting minutes, interview transcripts are managed in vivo. I use a directed content analysis, developing a code book that's based on the literature. Immerse yourself in the codes. I have another two additional coders that work with me. We always have 2 reviewers assigned to each text, each document for coding, and then we merge, reconcile the coding, review the excerpts, preparing narrative summaries. We share themes. So once I have the first set of narrative summaries that come out for each code, I present themes to the steering committee, which includes community partners, researchers, and then we contextualize the data, take those meeting minutes to then further prepare, to help to preparing the cases. And then we again present the cases back to the partners once they're prepared for further synthesis. So here's from one example from one of the code books. We have codes related to outreach and education, engagement, goal setting, planning. And then we have formalized blueprints, strategies that they use might be campaigning, collaboration, contesting, policy change, procedural change, and then environmental change within that. And so I'll share with you some of the findings to date that we've been working on. And we're still in process of preparing the final case. But some of the key things to date, we've seen that political history has really shaped each community's approach to translating environmental science. And part of that is, for example, in Somerville was a community where those who were once marginalized hold a lot of political power within the groups. And their approach to public health action has been highly top down because of their access. And so populations that are once marginalized, that were new immigrants at the time of the building of the 93, have since really gained political power in their approach to city governance. They have a lot of access. The partners there have a lot of access to city government leaders, as well as state government representatives. And so they've really worked on bringing in state representatives to all the community meetings. They've done a lot of lobbying of state officials, as well as in the local municipality. They're oftentimes, the folks, they started out with a lot of letter writing campaigns. They have a lot of credibility within City Hall. In Chinatown, they have a long history of bottom-up social action, and the community, they have a highly organized infrastructure where they're disseminating. They have a block captain system, so it's more of like a building captain now because of the high rises that have gone in, where they can turn out. We had a planning charrette in the middle of the hot summer, and turned out 90 people for an event in a very short amount of time, but it's because of the infrastructure that is there within the community. So in terms of the systems where we're seeing change, we see change at the resident level, a lot of education that's happening to increase awareness. You have to remember that traffic-related air pollution, or particularly ultrafine particulate matter, odorless, colorless substance, right? It's not on the front of the mind, and you're trying to create change within the community where issues like affordable housing are a concern, jobs are a concern, and so thinking about TRAP is not necessarily on the forefront. And so there's been just a lot of education with residents and organizing on the ground, a lot of developer education to understand what you can do. Folks are really trying to change developer practices in terms of what are the types of filters they're using in homes, municipal decision makers, and that's both in the planning departments as well as Board of Health. And getting planning and Board of Health to talk to each other. And then at the state level, they've had to do a lot of work. Some in the beginning within Somerville, it started state conversations were really about thinking about allocation of funds, whether it's really putting up a sound wall, which I'll talk about in a minute, or a sound barrier, which I'll talk about in a minute, or thinking about transportation routes and extending train service. But an interesting thing that came out of it is this whole idea of building codes. And there are some things within the building code is under state purview, not at the local planning level. So there's been some pieces there with home rule decisions that have been a challenge. And then there's also this idea of federal decision making, which there hasn't been as much of a push around, but the partners really recognizing that there needs to be a push there because they're related to cars. So in Somerville, some of the focus areas, I'll say the artwork you see here is from a planning charrette that we held with the community, where they were envisioning a sound barrier. Sound barriers were a big discussion in Somerville. On one side of the highway, which at the time the 93 was constructed, was more of a white middle-class neighborhood. They got sound barriers at the time of construction, but on the Somerville side, there were no sound barriers. And sound barriers don't stop air pollution or ultrafine particulate exposure, but they can divert or displace the pollution depending on the airflow. So there's been some interest as a way to reduce. There's also been a push in Somerville at municipal legislation, another top-down strategy that it hasn't passed yet, but there is a push there. And there's also been some discussion about addressing the building codes, but the building codes, because they're governed by the state, the Board of Health has not pushed further on that because if they have to put in a home rule petition, and they're kind of, sometimes it's that you have to choose your battles of where you want to go. So that has not gone through yet. The Somerville organizers have gotten together with another group of organizers called the EJ Table or Environmental Justice Table. And they were working on an air pollution lawsuit. And so Somerville did join together on that legislation. And so they do have, not legislation, the litigation. So they do have a piece of litigation that they are working on. And then they're doing some work through local representatives around retrofitting windows in public housing along the highway. And so that has been one change. And they've also done, I don't have it on here, but they've done a lot of work with local developers. And so increasing the filter, the MERV value in air filters. They've done work there. And then their strategies have been mainly campaigning. They've done a lot of letter writing. I mentioned the educating local officials, testifying. They're doing the collaborative efforts. They're working a lot on resident engagement, education, across stakeholder groups. They're building alliances with other coalitions, and then they have the lawsuit to the contestant. They're also continuously building an evidence base. This group is very into research in Somerville. And so they're doing, they have a number of projects that they're doing with Tufts in engineering and getting the city to partner with researchers to do further studies. And so they've been really pushing the research angle. And that's the group that initially got CAFE underway and pushed Tufts to do research around near highway in the first place. In Chinatown, they are using a community development strategy. The images you see here, the first is a community planning charrette. They've been using a collaborative effort of community engagement, education, storytelling. The image you see at the bottom is from a washing exhibit. It's an art project, a public art project that was an urban planning student at MIT. Came to a few of the master planning meetings and then started working on this art exhibit, which was launched in the fall. And then they've really had to work to embed TRAP or air traffic related air pollution into their master planning process because it couldn't be, there's so many other issues that they're working on that it didn't make sense to focus on TRAP alone. They wouldn't get public momentum around it. And so they've really worked to embed it in the existing issues, efforts around affordable housing and healthy public realm. So continued efforts, there's continued action going on in both of the communities. We've also recently put in place that study of in-home air filtration in Somerville. It's a randomized control trial, and my role on that is really working to study people's behaviors around the acceptability of in-home air and the acceptability of in-home air filtration, because if we do find positive outcomes, if thinking from a policy perspective, if it is not acceptable to have the air filtration in the home, or people don't want to keep it turned on, it's not going to be a viable solution. And then the other continued effort we have is partnering with Chinese Progressive Association on a new near highway study that I'm co-leading that's focused on research examining susceptibility to particles in roadway exhaust, respire, and that is a youth-led participatory action research project focused on near highway exposure translation. It's another research and action study, but the action component is youth-led for that version. And then just in terms of that ongoing contesting of oppressive structures, I think is important to highlight that although the CAFE study overall, the work has been very successful in terms of impact from the perspective of university, it's because it's brought in a lot of funding. The studies are published in very high ranking journals. At the same time, it's been the community partners have found it impactful because they've been able to make changes that improve health in the community. It's brought together a number of partners to focus on air pollution that were not previously working together to support one another, whether it's the Massachusetts Area Planning Council, the local public health departments are very involved, and local planners. And there's been a lot of momentum and conversation. It's been able to help support the master planning process in Chinatown and to really embed air pollution into discussions there. There's still oppressive structures at play in terms of thinking about the context of the team dynamics and how that plays out and the challenges that are experienced by CAFE study. Whether it's trust between partners and challenging, there are organizational barriers oftentimes to still struggle to through whether it's contracting with community partners, power dynamics within the community, or broader societal structures at play. But one thing I think the team has been keeping in the back of their mind, and we talk about this, we have every now and then refresher meetings where we're really focused on partnership dynamics and how we're working together, and really remembering that discomfort is the root of all learning and growth, and that we're having to critically self-reflect, making the implicit explicit. And it's important that we're also assessing our structures. This is us on the research side, as well as our partners, but really paying attention to process, because we could get caught up easily. And given our system of rewards within the academy and what's viewed as important, we could get caught up in the publications or bringing in the grants. But we really are doing this because we want to advance justice. We want to make sure that everyone has access to clean air. We want to make sure that everyone can go outside and outdoors and at particular times of day and not have to worry about increased exposure. And so we want to pay attention to process so that we're always centering our goal of advancing justice. And we want to be, to that end, contesting oppressive systems and structures, promoting power sharing. And I think this piece from Adrienne Marie Brown, where she calls for this idea of generative conflict and making sure that we're having those really difficult conversations about dynamics and how they're impeding our partnerships and our ability to work together collaboratively, and making sure we're including people who are most impacted by decisions in the decision-making process. So I will stop there.
So thank you, Linda, for that amazing presentation. I feel like I learned a lot, and I would also be interested in seeing your references slide because I know that that you've made me want to read more too. So we have some questions from the audience. I also have some questions that I'd like to start with. So first, I just want to say that I really appreciated that your presentation began with an overview of structural racism, white supremacy, and the connection between ideology, capitalism, and oppression. And then, tied to that, your discussion of, this research approach, this approach to action research, having an explicit justice focus or, justice mandate. I think that we know that research has sometimes been used to reproduce dominant ideology, justify oppressive policies. And sometimes we can think about the problem with that type of research as coming from biased motivations, that they're racists who are doing the work, or biased theory, that, right, that they don't realize that, that their ideologies are, reproducing, white supremacy culture. But then this is an interesting idea that this can also be connected to their, to methods or approach. And so you talk about how CBPR is not a method, but it's an approach that can be employed across methods. And so I'd like to hear, do you think, right, are research methods value neutral? Does the problem lie with the method or the approach? And I know that recently there's been some folks writing about decolonizing methods. So let's start with that. So, right, do you think, methods are value neutral?
It's a great question. I'm trying to think of like, is anything value neutral? but I think that even when you think about the different research methods we use, there are, and it's really the way we approach it, right? Are we including or are we excluding in the concept and in how we're implementing our methods, right? Are we creating space for people to be part of the process? Are we engaging in a siloed way? Are we, I think of the example I gave while I was talking was around like big data or data analysis. If I'm gonna do a study of youth violence, or here's an example. So youth violence, right? Or youth substance use. There's an example from the summer. So doing a project around youth substance use, I could study that in a lot of different ways. And I could, because if I want to implement an intervention around youth substance use, who needs to be part of that process? Who needs to be included in that process to decide how it works, right? Shouldn't young people be part of that process? Should I be designing an intervention on to address youth substance use without having young people at the table to be part of informing that approach? So the methods are the methods, but how are we using the methods? Are we using them to exclude folks? Are we using them, to engage folks in a process? I think that's the question. And some people would argue that, well, if you're including people in that process, then it's biased. Like you can't include, but how you could not include people in the process and it could also be biased. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question, but.
No, I think you absolutely are. And yet you answered my second question too, which was how can we use this approach to critique, whatever methods we're using. And so I think you answered A and B.
Yeah.
Now, so what would you say to junior scholars who are interested in doing community-based participatory research, but are worried about how labor intensive it is, and think that it could be, a barrier to getting tenure if it means that their projects take longer than they would take otherwise?
Yeah, I would say that that's a great question. We had last week we did a talk with deans about this topic of community-based participatory research or participatory research methods and tenure and promotion. And I think and I'm coming from, a school of social work, right? And so where we're interested in advancing social justice. And so I think one of the things that I have doctoral students who work with me right now, 3 of them who are using some participatory methods in their work. And I would say that it takes time to build partnerships. And so, what kinds of resources and supports do you have at your institution for engaging in partnerships? I think that it's possible, 100% possible, to do a participatory dissertation. I've worked with all the doctoral students I work with do participatory dissertations. I think you need to be thinking about what are your goals. So overall, I think with doctoral students, what are your goals? What do you want to do when you're done? Do you want to go into the academy? Do you want to go into agency or practice or institution? And then what does your CV need to look like in order to go into each of those tracks? And so if you're interested in going into an academic position, you need to be publishing during your PhD. And so how will you build partnerships and publish? And there are different ways to do that. there are ways to work on, maybe you're working with your faculty member and you're publishing, maybe your faculty member that you're working with has partnerships. And it's my job as a faculty member to make sure that I'm leveraging the resources that I have to connect the doctoral students I work with. Although, sometimes doctoral students I work with already have partnerships. So there are a lot of factors at play. But I think my job as a faculty is to ask those kind of questions. Well, who do you want to partner with? Like, what's your research topic? Who are the key stakeholders that might, who has a stake in that research? Who's most impacted? If you're interested in studying, I don't know, say you're interested in studying health equity, for example, or among young people. So do you have young people that you're already connected with? Where are your connections already? And then, okay, so what kind of questions do you have? How feasible is it for that to do that research? But those are kinds of conversations you're having with faculty at your institution that are going to support you doing the work, because you're also going to want to make sure, if you're doing research with young people, for example, you're going to need funds to pay the young people. Or, if you're wanting to do research with a group or an organization that you're partnering with, what kind of resources will you need to do that? And so as a faculty member, I have to leverage resources to make sure that students have the resources they need to do the work. So I guess, sorry, that was a long answer to a short question, but it's complicated because I think that one of the reasons that research is time consuming sometimes is because you're trying to figure out, how do I get the resources to be able to do the work? But if you have the resources, then you can just do the work. And so some of that is for the student, but then some of that is for us in the institution when we're having students come in. If we know they want to do participatory work, making sure they're connected, especially if they're new to the city, making sure they have the connections in the city when they get there. If they're going to do the work back in where they're from and they already have connections, then making sure they have the resources to fly back and forth, because you can't, that's I think some of that's on us.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So along those lines around resources, we have a couple folks in the audience who have asked about, grants and these methods. So first, are the places where you've been looking for funding, do they understand the time and budget implications of CBPR, the CBPR approach, and do they fund those accordingly? And then second, so grant writing often demands community organizations and communities to adhere and aspire to the data that oppressive institutions want us to see, demanding many of us to achieve unattainable goals and through a white capitalist lens of productivity. So how can we wield community-based participatory action or research to reverse that position and power and grant issuing and funding of community projects?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think a lot of times, when you, I'll tell you a story. So I remember I was writing a grant. Most of the grants I have had have been funded by NIH or small foundations, National Institutes of Health or small foundations. And I remember writing a grant to NIH that didn't get funded. And so then my mentor was reading the grant after and was like, Linda, are you angry? And I was like, what do you mean? But they were like, this language, like the language you're using in this grant is not like language you would use with NIH. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm writing about capitalist systems and structures. And if we use a community organizing approach, we can begin to, but so my mentor and I was kind of like pushing back, like, why should I have to change the way I do things? This is the way I do things. But the reality was that in order sometimes people can't hear what we're saying unless we're speaking their language. And so I was kind of like, well, I don't know how I feel about that. But sometimes it's, do you have time to find the funder who's the right funder who you can work with? And that's not always there. But I do think that part of it, and this goes back to that whole no data, no problem, that early lesson I learned, is that part of it is how do we have to move our funders just as much as we have to move our institutions. And some of that is challenging, right? So how do we, right now we're seeing more funding towards CVPR than we have in the past, right? In the past, it was hard to push CBPR, and it was seen as a novel approach. Community-based participatory research methods were seen as novel, but now more and more people are funding them. But at the same time, in some ways, you would say that they're becoming co-opted because people are being funded to do participatory research, but aren't interested. They're interested in doing research, but not necessarily advancing justice. And so there's that balance. But I do think, to your question, is how do you one, find the right funders for the work that you're doing, which sometimes might not be a federal funder, right? It might be a series of donors. It might be community foundation. It might be, they're thinking about the right funder, because that's an important piece. I had a project once where we were funded to do work with young people to advance equity. And they were really interested in like sugar sweetened beverage consumption and dietary change. And the young people, when we did the participatory project, they were like talking about structural racism and police violence. And the funder was kind of like, whoa, this is not what I funded. And so we had to kind of backstep and say, well, you funded a project around youth health. You wanted us to use a participatory approach. We use a participatory approach. We listened to young people. This is what young people told us. They told us about how these things get in the way of their health. And so that was a very difficult conversation. And, you know, I will say I wasn't funded by that funder again. But I think that the work that the young people did was important. And then we have to find the right funder for the follow-up or action. How do we fund the action? I think sometimes the other challenge is that there's funding for the research, but not for the action. And so it's kind of being prepared to find both, because the worst thing you can do with it is working with community partners is to go and to put in a grant and think you're going to get to the research and action and not get to the action. Because then they, like you said, the question said, the person who answered the question, I almost said the caller, but we're not on a radio show. Said that the community agency's gone and done all this work to put the grant in with you, and then they're not getting their needs met at the end of it. And the goal of this work is to make sure that everyone's getting their needs met through the process. And so that's an important piece. The other piece with that is that I think for us as researchers is this fine line where I don't want to say, well, managing expectations in some ways. Like when we put in a grant, we don't know if we're going to get funded. So sometimes we have to put in a lot of grants to get a grant. And you can't expect for community partners to be doing all the legwork. And so for us, sometimes we have to leverage the resources in our institutions to put together the grants for community partners, making sure that they're still making the decisions, that I don't in that process decide I'm going to make all the decisions. Look, I've done the grant for you, but then I haven't included any of your decisions. I'm writing a grant right now for a partner. And I have to stop myself, right, and be reflective and say, Linda, did you bring the most recent draft? No, we have to meet regularly. I put together a draft of it, show it to the partner. What do you think? Did I capture this? Is this what you want to see? This is what will happen if it's funded. This is how long it will take. But we don't know if it's going to be funded. So how much time do you want to put in the beginning? I think over time, as you develop trust with partners, it's your friends, your colleagues, so you're working on things together. And I know what my role is like. So I think that's important.
Thank you. So there were a couple other people who were interested in kind of the nitty gritty of doing this style of research. And so I'm trying to put a few questions together here, but what are the barriers to IRB that may be unique, right, to CBPR? And then do you have any best practices to share around the use of stipends, compensation, project dissemination, including things around photo voice, which we didn't touch on today, but I know you have a history with photo exhibits, et cetera.
Yeah, so I'll start with IRB. I think knowing your IRB and make sure your IRB knows about community-based participatory research. Every IRB is a little bit different. IRBs are interpreting a set of regulations, and unfortunately, that's not the same across all institutions. I can say that some of the research I was doing at Tufts, when I brought, that was expedited when I got to BU was exempt, and vice versa. And so how the research is interpreted, it's really making sure that your IRB understands your research. And so part of that is like, you know, doing an informational interview with your IRB. It's kind of like a one-on-one. You want to do a one-on-one. You want them to know what CBPR is. Recently, for part of my role with the CTSI, we did a whole session with IRBs and kind of learning how they operate. One of the things I was able to do at Tufts was to, for example, so I'm going to back up. So the IRB is the Institutional Review Board is thinking about human subjects research. They're thinking about minimizing risk, maximizing benefit. You know, even the human subjects trainings, like now is the CITI, so that your human subjects training certifications, when you're working with community partners, they're going to have to do all those human subjects training certifications. So they're not always user-friendly. They're not always available in multiple languages. I had a project where we were conducting all of our research was focused on transnationalism among Brazilians and Dominicans. And so all of our research was conducted in Portuguese and Spanish, and the IRB training wasn't available in Portuguese and Spanish. And so we have over time created trainings, PowerPoint presentations based on the CITI that we can deliver. And we'll have that will count towards approval. So it's working with your institutional review board, letting them know who your partners are, who your research team is, what your goals are, what is community-based participatory research, why are you doing it, so that they have a sense of the scope of it, and what infrastructure you need to make sure that your teams are able to train. So that is important. I think also realizing that what your institutional review board considers to be research ethics concerns will be different than what your community considers to be research ethics concerns. And that you need to take those ethics concerns that your community partners have just as seriously as you would your institutional review board. Because a lot of times the expectations that our partners have of us of being transparent, accountable, making sure we're sharing data, making sure that everyone has equitable access to the data, making sure we're not publishing things without our partners interpreting them, and not just publishing the results from our lens, but from the team's lens. Like all those things are ethical issues as well. And how we're sharing our finances are also ethical issues. And then the stipends, I think, was the next question in terms of payments. So payments are challenging. So I do a lot of youth-led participatory action research. We hire the young people as researchers working with us. We are usually paying the young people an hourly rate, hiring them on as an hourly rate. And recently here, I'll tell you a story of how the best intentions gone wrong. So we're thinking about like equitable wage, living wage in the city of Boston, what should we be paying young people? So we're thinking like, $15 to $19 an hour, working on the project. We're presenting it. We present that to our study advisory board, which is made up of young people. It's made up of adults and who are community partners. And some of our community partners said, you can't do that. You can't pay young people that much money. That's wrong. And we were like, what do you mean we can't pay? You don't want us to pay young people? We don't want to be exploitative. We're always accused of being exploitative in the institution. And it was a great lesson learned, because some of the challenges is that what happens if you're paying young people more than their parents make? And what does that do with the dynamic? And have you thought of that? And we were like, oh, we need to rethink that. Like, let's have a conversation. And so let's talk with the families, figure out how we want to do this. And do we need to do an intergenerational project so that we're hiring young people and adults together? Is the other question, because there's a workforce issue here, making sure people are being compensated. So we have to think of all those. Oftentimes, when we're doing YPARs now, it's really hard. We've tried to come up with systems to hire young people directly to the university. It's challenging. We were able one summer to hired 14-year-olds as a research team. It was a lot of paperwork, getting them through the university paperwork system. Now, for projects I've done since then, it's better to just contract the money to the community partner organization that works with young people, provide the research training, but through that partnership, because our partners are used to paying young people, they're good at paying young people. We would try to mirror what they were paying them, but it makes sense to just to provide the resources, like what we're doing with the city school example, is to provide the resources to the partner. They know what they're doing. We do our the research training and the YPAR training and work in collaboration, but the resources and funds go to the community partner. It's easier. We were thinking of it from a workforce development standpoint, thinking, wow, you can, if you have worked for the university on your CV, but it's just as good to partner, have that partnership piece on the CV. Did I get all the questions? Photo voice stipends vary. It'll vary from agency to agency. We'll usually work with the agency. We also take into account the tax implications, which sometimes you don't think about. But if you pay the young people and if they're working with you for a long period of time, and if the taxes aren't being taken out of the check, sometimes we'll do a stipend. So like, I think it's $599 or underneath for a small short-term project, so that there's no tax implications for the families, because it can mess up their family income. So we'll usually work with folks to figure out what the best rates are with the community partner organization, see how they do it. Because if sometimes the university wants to pay as consultants, and then it's very complicated for young people and families to do the tax piece.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. One is going to be related to process and another to the implications of the process. So first, you talked a lot throughout the presentation about relationship development and building relationships with the community, from helping junior scholars to do that, from that being step one, and beginning with this approach. So what are some of the first steps to beginning that relationship building process? In particular, how do you build trust within communities who have been oppressed by the institutions that are seeking to partner with them, right? I know that, elite universities don't have the best history.
Well, so the I think trust building relationships, especially like if you're getting to a new community, like if I was going to a new community, I just doing one-on-ones, like with different agencies, meeting with folks, learning a little bit about them. I just started working with a new organization here in Boston that is a grassroots organization. And I started out volunteering. Like I became a volunteer at the organization, talked to them. They know I'm a researcher. They know because they met me through the Boston Public Health Commission, but they needed support in evaluation and setting up data systems within there. It's a grassroots organization that works with women on all sides of community violence. And so I started volunteering there. I was set up some data systems for them, did some focus groups with them, and then they wanted to write a grant at one point. I wrote a couple of grants that I wasn't part of. It was just for the agency. And then we just started chatting, having coffee. And though we haven't put in a grant together yet, but we've worked together on another project. And I suspect that eventually we'll put in a grant together. But right now we're just getting to know each other. So I think that's the other piece. Like sometimes you got to get out there and just get to know people. You can't be like, hey, Rob, nice to meet you. You want to write a grant? Can I write a grant with you? It can't always be about the grant. It can just be about like, what are you doing? Your organization's doing some cool work in the community. This is what I do. You interested in having coffee? Oh, do you need support and volunteer? Or sometimes there'll be, you need a student. Okay, you're interested in having a social work student. Oh, you need someone to supervise because you don't have a social worker on staff. Okay, let me see if I can leverage one of my other partnerships to work. But it's just kind of building rapport, like any relationship. You meet someone, you start to talk to them, you get to know them, and you decide if you want to talk to them more. And sometimes community partners are like, yeah, you're a researcher, I don't know you. But I think it's just kind of sometimes through your networks too. If like I'll have some of my partners from agencies I worked with for years. I work with an agency, community health centers here. And so she'll introduce me to different partners at other agencies and say, oh, this is Linda. She's one of the good researchers. I'm like, I'm not that good. I still work for the institution. I am who I am, but I can't, this is where I work and that's what I do. So I think it's just being honest and not building relationships with organizations just because you want something from them or want to partner with them, but because you find like there's something they're doing that's aligned with something you're interested in doing.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. And the last question, can you talk a little bit more about the shifting of power? So things like budget control as the project unfolds. So how should researchers think about that? Are there any best practices to keep in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the budget is always a hard one. I think being open about the budget from the beginning is important. I had a mentor early on, and he would share the whole budget. And he said it's hard because we don't live in a country where we tell people our salary, but that's not the case everywhere. Some places it's more public. So I think we are just very, very open about budgets for the projects, and this is how much money we have. This is where it's spent. Being as transparent as possible, and the more you can use participatory budgeting, the better. The more you can with your partners to say, we have like, I don't know what your grant is. Say we have $100,000, $200,000 grant. On the university side, this is what it costs to do business. This is what it costs to do things. And on, this is what we want to get the community side. Where does it make sense for this grant to sit? I have a grant, I have a couple of the grants I do with the Boston Public Health Commission. They go through the commission and then they subcontract like a piece to me, or sometimes I work as a consultant for them separately. But then sometimes like the grant we're working on now, they're like, this grant we want to put it through the university. And so we put that one through the university and then I subcontract to them. So I think the more you can be transparent about the budget, and it's sometimes uncomfortable because it's another one of those things we don't always talk about, money out loud. But it's important. And I think the ownership of data is another thing you need to talk about early on. Who owns the data? Where does it sit? Where does it go? When can you access it? Am I going to have to, like, I have a community partner, like they're like, Linda, am I going to have to wait for you to write a paper before I get this data? Because I need it for a grant, right? Or I need it for this. And that's an important thing, because sometimes as researchers, we want to hold on to it till we publish it. But sometimes our community partners need it. And so you have to have those conversations about data ownership really early. What's the process going to look like? Well, where is it going to sit? I have a partner I was working with for a long time. It was where I was like, well, we're cleaning the data. It's, I'm almost done. I'm just cleaning the data and I'll get it to you. And then they were like, finally, like, we don't know what you're doing to the data, but we want to see it. Like, what have you done to it? We want to see what it looked like before you cleaned it. And I'm like, cleaning it. But then I had to explain what I meant by cleaning the data. They thought I was cooking the books. I don't know. But I had to kind of explain, like, I'm just kind of like getting it into a format that's readable. But we had to have a conversation about that. And then we had to talk about, well, who owns the data? But the minute when you're putting the grant in, when you're writing the grant, you've got to be talking about all these things early on. If you're not talking about them early on, it's a surprise. It's something you've hidden. And our institutions have hidden things from communities. And it's not our fault. It's not the people who work there now, but that's happened historically. So if we're not open about everything early on, then we're going to run into problems later.
Incredible.
So we'll talk about overhead. Can we talk about overhead?
Yeah.
I didn't know what overhead was when I became a researcher. I was like, what do you mean overhead? And then I had to be like, wow, wait a minute. On every $100,000 of federal money, we get $65,000 extra. Do community partners have a negotiated overhead? Not all of our partners do. And so learning some of those things along the way is important, because you have to be able to explain them and talk about them and be transparent, because that gets us a lot of times as partners. Like, wait a minute, why are you getting all this extra money? Where's that going? I thought the grant was only 100,000. It says 165. I thought that grant was only $1 million. It's $1.6 million. So those are important things.
Yeah. Well, this is incredible. So thank you so much for these thoughtful responses to all of these questions. So right now, I think that we're done with the Q&A. I just wanted to turn it to you for a moment to see if you have any final remarks.
I think, no, I appreciate all the questions. I think they're important questions. I think that it is participatory research, anything you do in partnership, the more people you add to anything, it takes a little bit longer. So it is something to take into account, but at the same time, it takes a little bit longer. also the richer, right? The richer the information, the richer the data, the more people the more perspectives we're able to bring. And we really need to have the perspectives of people that are impacted at the table, because if not, we're going to miss something. I always give the example of, it's been a long time since I was 14 years old, and, I have a 14-year-old, but it's different when I'm thinking about research. When I'm working with young people, I'm learning so much. And so I think that the investment is worth it, because, and to invest the time in those relationships, because that's really how you address like white supremacy. And because white supremacy is designed to divide us, it's designed to silo us, it's designed to say, you're the expert, you have the power, but really we all have to own it collectively. So I think that if we're going to find and create the new world, we have to start like working more together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. I'm going to turn it back to Dean Begg for final remarks here.
That was just terrific. Thank you both, Dr. Martinez and Dr. Eschmann, for an important and a really exciting conversation about research that is designed to push boundaries and uproot white supremacy and promote justice. Dr. Eschmann, thanks for the excellent moderating. And Dr. Martinez, thank you for your superb presentation and the impactful work that you are doing in this space. You're demonstrating how partnering equitably with communities can lead to so much greater insight and learning when we don't limit ourselves to more traditional approaches. It's really refreshing and inspiring. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. I wish you all the best.